The title, "The International Court of Justice declared Israel an illegitimate state," evokes a powerful and highly sensitive scenario that, as of now, has not occurred in reality. However, if we were to imagine a speech built around this hypothetical declaration, it would explore deep-rooted historical, legal, and moral dimensions of one of the world's most enduring and painful conflicts. Such a speech would not merely address a court ruling, but would reflect centuries of struggle, displacement, political upheaval, and the moral debate surrounding nationhood, human rights, and justice. The hypothetical declaration by the International Court of Justice would represent a seismic moment in international law and diplomacy. It would signal that the international community, through its highest legal body, had taken a firm stance against what it considered the foundation or conduct of the Israeli state. Such a statement would not happen lightly. It would come after years, if not decades, of accumulating evidence, hearings, arguments, and geopolitical shifts. The court would base such a decision not just on politics but on legal interpretations of occupation, annexation, displacement of people, settlement activity, and breaches of international humanitarian law. This declaration would likely follow overwhelming findings that Israel's establishment or ongoing actions directly violated core principles of international law, including the rights of self-determination, sovereignty, and protection of civilians. This decision would be a voice for the millions of Palestinians who have lived under occupation, lost their homes, and endured war, embargoes, and statelessness. To them, it might feel like a long overdue acknowledgement of their pain and a formal recognition of their right to exist in dignity, peace, and justice. For years, their voices have been raised in refugee camps, in international forums, and in protest movements around the world, calling for recognition, for justice, and for a future that does not treat them as invisible. This declaration, if it ever came, would feel like the world was finally listening. At the same time, this speech would also need to recognize the complicated reality on the ground. Israel is not just an idea or a legal term. It is a land filled with people, families, cities, and lives that have evolved over decades. A court ruling might declare illegitimacy from a legal standpoint, but it would not erase the human dimension or the need for peace and reconciliation. Such a declaration would demand not just legal consequences but a global movement toward building a new path, one that addresses the pain on both sides, but especially offers restitution, return, and dignity to the oppressed. It would not be a moment of revenge, but a moment of reckoning. The goal would not be to create more chaos, but to correct historic wrongs and lay the foundation for a truly just and lasting peace. This speech would not be complete without reminding the world that justice delayed is justice denied. For over 75 years, the international community has watched the suffering of Palestinians while often remaining silent or neutral. The hypothetical ruling would symbolize a new chapter, one where the law is not just a tool for the powerful, but a shield for the powerless. It would challenge nations to stand on the right side of history, not by issuing statements but by taking real action, ending arms sales that fuel the occupation, supporting international investigations, and ensuring that human rights are not just ideals but enforceable realities. Ultimately, the declaration would not be about destroying a state, but about reconstructing the meaning of justice, human dignity, and international responsibility. It would be a wake-up call for all humanity to reevaluate what it means to support freedom, to oppose oppression, and to ensure that the lessons of the past are not repeated. This moment, if it ever came, would be as much about the future as it is about the past. A future where peace is built not on denial but on truth, and where justice is not feared but embraced. If the International Court of Justice were ever to declare Israel an illegitimate state, the foundation of such a decision would rest on deep and complex legal grounds. The ICJ is not a political body. It operates within the framework of international law and global treaties, and its rulings are based on legal reasoning, precedents, and factual analysis. In this hypothetical scenario, the ICJ would have reviewed decades of documentation, including UN resolutions, Geneva Conventions, and testimonies regarding human rights violations, occupation policies, and the legality of territorial claims. The court would likely point to consistent violations of international law, particularly regarding the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories and the construction of settlements that have been repeatedly deemed illegal by numerous international bodies. These settlements violate the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits an occupying power from transferring its civilian population into the territory it occupies. Israel's continued expansion into the West Bank and East Jerusalem, despite countless UN resolutions condemning these actions, would be central to the court's argument of illegitimacy. Another crucial legal argument would involve the denial of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. This principle is a cornerstone of international law, enshrined in the UN Charter and numerous other treaties. By controlling borders, airspace, water resources, and even the movement of people in Palestinian areas, Israel would be seen as systematically undermining the Palestinians' ability to govern themselves, develop their economy, or live freely. The ICJ would consider whether Israel's policies amount not only to occupation but to long-term colonization and apartheid, terms already used by multiple international human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. If the court agreed with these characterizations, it could further bolster the argument that Israel's very structure and function as a state violate fundamental norms of international law. The ICJ might also examine the historical circumstances of Israel's creation in 1948, specifically focusing on whether the formation of the state respected the legal and humanitarian standards required by international bodies at the time. The mass displacement of Palestinians during the Nakba, when over 700,000 people were forced to flee or were expelled from their homes, could be interpreted as ethnic cleansing. If the court found that Israel was founded through systematic violence and the denial of rights to the indigenous population, it might argue that the state's legitimacy was compromised from the start. In this context, legitimacy isn't just about recognition by other states, but about the legal and moral foundation upon which a state is built and maintained. Furthermore, the ICJ would likely take into account Israel's ongoing disregard for international rulings and resolutions. Despite multiple condemnations from the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and human rights bodies, Israel has continued policies like the blockade of Gaza, which has created a humanitarian crisis affecting millions. The use of military force in densely populated civilian areas and the repeated targeting of infrastructure like hospitals and schools could be interpreted as war crimes. When a state repeatedly acts outside the bounds of international law, even after being warned or sanctioned, its standing under that law becomes more vulnerable. In the eyes of the court, legitimacy is not just about the past, it's also about the present. A state that systematically violates the rights of millions of people, refuses to comply with international norms, and obstructs peace efforts may no longer be considered legitimate under the law. This doesn't mean the state ceases to exist physically, but it means the international community no longer accepts it as lawful, just, or morally defensible. Such a ruling would be based on hard legal facts, not ideology, and would reflect a growing global consensus that justice must finally take precedence over politics. If the International Court of Justice were to declare Israel an illegitimate state, it would represent a powerful recognition of the long-ignored suffering and denied rights of the Palestinian people. For over 7 decades, Palestinians have lived without a state of their own, many of them in exile in refugee camps or under military occupation. Generations have grown up stateless, without the ability to freely travel, vote in national elections, or feel the basic dignity that comes with sovereignty. A decision of this kind would be more than a legal judgment. It would serve as a symbolic and moral validation of their decades-long struggle for freedom, justice, and self-determination. It would give voice to the millions who have been silenced by history, by politics, and by the military machinery of a much more powerful state. This declaration would recognize that the Palestinian people have been systematically denied their right to self-determination, which is one of the most sacred principles in international law. That right is not simply about creating a flag or electing a president. It is about being able to shape one's destiny without the control or coercion of a foreign power. It is about building a society with its own schools, courts and institutions, not under the shadow of checkpoints, airstrikes, or military raids. The court's decision would acknowledge that Israel's policies over the years, such as land seizures, settlement expansions, and strict military control, have effectively prevented Palestinians from forming a viable and independent state. The ruling would give legal weight to what Palestinians have known and felt for decades, that their very existence has been restricted by a system designed to suppress their identity and deny their basic human rights. For the families who were displaced in 1948 during the Nakba, and for those driven from their homes in later conflicts, such a decision would be an acknowledgement that their suffering was not an accident of history, but the result of deliberate actions. It would give historical context to the loss of homes, the bulldozing of villages, and the rewriting of maps that erased centuries of Palestinian presence. It would show the world that these people were not forgotten, that international law sees them, hears them, and stands with them. For the children growing up in Gaza, where electricity, clean water, and medicine are often luxuries, this could be a glimmer of hope. It would suggest that justice is not just a dream but a real possibility, something they can believe in and work toward. This decision would also shift the global conversation around Palestinian rights. For too long, many countries have taken a neutral or cautious stance, either out of fear of political backlash or alliances with powerful nations. But with such a ruling, neutrality would no longer be acceptable. Nations would be forced to confront the reality that continued silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of complicity. The world would have to ask itself hard questions about where it stands on human rights, colonialism, and the legacy of occupation. The Palestinian people, after years of being told to wait, to compromise, or to accept less than they deserve, would finally see their cause elevated to the highest stage of international law. For every mother who lost a child, for every father who couldn't protect his home, for every student denied the chance to travel or study abroad, and for every worker trapped behind a wall, this declaration would say your struggle matters. It would affirm that justice may be slow, but it is not blind. It would tell the Palestinian people that the world has heard their cries, and through the voice of the law is now ready to stand beside them. This moment would not undo their pain, but it could mark the beginning of true recognition and the long road to healing, dignity, and eventual peace. If the International Court of Justice were to declare Israel an illegitimate state, the political shockwaves around the globe would be immediate and intense. Such a decision from the highest legal authority in the world would force every country, especially those with strong alliances or military partnerships with Israel, to re-evaluate their stance. Diplomatic relationships that have long been based on strategic interests would come under intense pressure from citizens, human rights groups, and political opposition. Nations that have previously stood by Israel out of loyalty or mutual interests would find it increasingly difficult to justify their support in the face of a legal ruling that questions the very legitimacy of the state they are backing. Some countries might move to downgrade diplomatic ties, impose sanctions, or begin formally recognizing the state of Palestine in more concrete ways. International organizations like the United Nations, the European Union, and the Arab League would be pushed to respond not with statements but with actions, potentially altering trade, defense cooperation, and multilateral negotiations. This kind of ruling would also have a massive impact on global public opinion. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, people would begin to ask deeper questions about their own governments' complicity in what they now understand to be a long-standing injustice. Citizens in democratic countries, especially, would pressure their leaders to take a moral stance, not just a political one. Protests, boycotts, and grassroots movements that have long supported Palestinian rights would find new energy and legitimacy. The ruling would embolden human rights activists and international legal scholars, many of whom have long been sidelined or criticized for questioning Israel's actions. It would validate decades of research, testimony, and fieldwork documenting the suffering of the Palestinian people and the systemic policies that have enabled it. Universities, media outlets, and think tanks around the world would shift the narrative from one of conflict between equals to one of colonialism, occupation, and now legal invalidation. On the international diplomatic stage, countries that have remained neutral or silent on the issue might no longer be able to do so. For example, nations in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia that have taken a back seat in Middle East politics might feel compelled to take a more vocal role. Alliances would be tested as countries align themselves either with the rule of international law or with long-standing strategic partners. Those who continue to support Israel despite the ICJ ruling might find themselves isolated in certain international forums or even facing legal and economic consequences for violating international norms. Military aid, trade agreements, and intelligence sharing might come under scrutiny. Nations that continue to send weapons or provide support could be accused of aiding a state